a joint venture between the open research section and the digital collections section of the digital scholarship section of ACRL. We are, Verletta Kern and I have put together a great panel of speakers here today, and the topic is Confronting Algorithmic Bias in Open Research Collections. As you listen to our presentations today, we invite you to tweet your thoughts and takeaways at hashtag ACRL DSS. Again, hashtag ACRL DSS. I'll put that in the chat as well. And I would ask everyone to, we're going to hold the questions until the end. However, we absolutely welcome sending questions into either the group chat or Verletta or myself personally. We're going to tabulate them, and if we end up having a lot of questions due to constraints of time, we'll pick and choose from that list. But definitely send them on. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. With that, oh great, I see that Verletta has shared the hashtag in the chat. So definitely tweet away. With that, I'm going to begin with our first presenter, Kate Dohe. Jason Clark will be following her. Kate Dohe is the manager of digital programs and initiatives in the the digital initiatives, oh, good Lord. We're just getting started with our day here in Seattle. Digital Programs and Initiatives Department in the University of Maryland Libraries. Kate's team oversees day-to-day activities related to digital repository management, digital preservation activities, research data services, and electronic publishing. Prior to joining UMD, she was the digital services librarian at Georgetown University and the digital librarian for an academic textbook publisher in California. She has worked on quite a number of great publications, including Care, Code, and Digital Libraries, Embracing Critical Practice in Digital Library Communities, which is published in the Library with a Lead Pipe. Lessons from the Field, What Improv Teaches Us About Collaborations, published with Aaron Pappas in Library Leadership and Management. The Cost of Keeping It, Towards Effective Cost Modeling for Digital Preservation at the University of Maryland, also co-authored with David Duran, published by iPress in the 2018 conference proceedings. And finally, Girls to the Front, What Riot Girl Tells Us About Women in Library IT. That is published in We Can Do IT, Women in Library Information Technology. Her presentation today is related to these publications and her current research topics called The Digital is Critical, Creating and Maintaining Radical Library Systems. And with that, I will cede the floor to Kate.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to present to everybody, via webinar to coming up on 200 attendees. That's exciting. And I'm going to try not to think about that number for the rest of this. So let me just get my screen share going. That will take just a second. All right. Hopefully everybody can see me and see my presentation as well. So the underlying assumption that kind of underpins the entire presentation that I'm about to give is on the premise that libraries are inherently not neutral. There's an extensive body of literature that illustrates the very real cultural, political, racial, and economic ways that the library and its employees are inherently not neutral. And if you're unfamiliar with that premise, there's a lot of good literature on the topic, most notably by Nina de Jesus, Chris Borg, Emily Drabinski, and many, many other scholars. And so consequently, the technological systems that are created and reproduced in our libraries are also inherently not neutral. They carry many of the same cultural markers and biases that come along with all of our work as librarian and cultural professionals. So in order to get into that idea of what we're talking about when it comes to library systems, I'm going to talk about, mostly because of my background, the digital library ecosystem. And so we have kind of like the way that I conceptualize it is sort of in two groups, right? So the first is, open source projects. And I'll come back to these and cover that in most detail because that's what the bulk of my discussion and my work is on. Ultimately, these are the things that we make and the systems that we have the most care for. The second set of projects, the commercial projects, represent both alternatives as well as risks to the former. So the idea being that the technological barriers for entry for open source projects continue to climb, and I'll get into some of the evidence and the research around that. Then an increasing amount of institutions who want to participate in digital scholarship or digital library projects must kind of choose a commercial solution. And that puts them kind of back into bed with a lot of the same organizations that have a very long and very famous track record of exploiting libraries, researchers, and users. Of those, Elsevier, who's the parent owner of the Digital Commons application, which is a digital library and digital publishing platform, is, as many of us know, at the flashpoint of kind of an existential conflict over library budgets and the price of scholarship, open access, and, what are and are not appropriate negotiation tactics in this marketplace. And it's also increasingly clear as they have bought more and more research and publishing products that had originally been for the open and free distribution of scholarship, that they are pivoting their business strategy to claim an increasingly large piece of the research enterprise pie, and through the acquisition of repository platforms. Academia.edu and ResearchGate, as other good examples, are social networks with commercial interests, and as the old adage goes, if you're not the customer, then you're the product, right? So when it comes to open source library systems, particularly in the digital library space, they carry a lot of influences from a variety of aspects. And I think of this in sort of like three ways. So first is the unique subculture of libraries, right? And library IT, which is fairly, generally speaking, tends to be largely male. It tends to be largely white, oftentimes in academic libraries, in my experience there. Library IT is physically isolated. I'm actually broadcasting to you right now from our basement. And it's just very far removed from a lot of the work of library operations at large. Even in my own group right now, we tend to think of this, and we even refer to it as the upstairs and the downstairs. It's just has a very, I would say, not precisely isolated, but we do have like a very, very strong microculture that is removed from library culture at large. Then there's an additional layer, which is the organizational level of influence, which, undeniably, many cultural heritage institutions have engaged in, and have histories in white supremacy and patriarchal practices in pursuit of neoliberal ends. Many still do today. And that inevitably means that the organizational wealth that's used to pay for the talent that sort of undergirds a lot of digital initiatives work is in fact a byproduct of our own sort of our oppressive and exclusive legacies in this area, and what our organizations carry with them. And then finally, there's a structural component of this when it comes to the governance of open source and digital library projects. Many of the governing organizations tend to have governing groups that influence and drive strategic direction, right? The makeup of these groups can often be dictated by institutional investment. Whether or not that is through direct contributions of wealth, through direct financial contributions and fees, or if it's by in-kind labor. Oftentimes that labor is pretty explicitly focused on software development and technological labor contributions. And the net result of this is that the library systems that we create and that we maintain carry all the weight of our organizations and the baggage of the uniquely masculine culture that produces and maintains them. there are some unique harms that go along with that. Some of them being accessibility, some of them being the technological cost of participation. Some institutions, as I alluded to earlier, the cost of open source participation is pretty high in terms of labor, as well as even in terms of participating in the governance and finances that have to be invested there. So there's technical cost that goes along with that. There's a significant level of expertise that needs to be in place for digital initiatives to be successful. And consequently, institutions that are not positioned to participate at that level often get left behind or left out of conversations about desirable features in many of these projects. Furthermore, there is some amount of distribution of emotional labor. So, given that this is a pretty significant group of folks, I would hazard a guess that many people in the audience right now are some variety of what I kind of call, again, because I have practiced this, the digital, etc. librarian. And that could be digital services, digital resources, digital initiatives, digital publishing, digital, etc. Like I said. And a lot of that work tends to be emotional labor, and it tends to be direct connection to users, oftentimes with a disconnect between actual strategic direction for a lot of digital library projects at large. And then finally, there's also a valorization of technical labor and technological solutionism that comes into play as well, right? So increasingly, digital initiatives and digital work is sort of put forth as this idea of the future of libraries. And Rafia Mirza and Mara Seal have written a very good chapter about much of this, where we increasingly place value on only working code and less so on the care work and emotional work that goes into librarianship, forging connections, collecting the user feedback, analyzing, assessing, patiently working with users, thinking through accessibility and workflows. And so as I've thought about this over the course of my career, this really drives home the notion that library systems should embrace a more radical practice, and that the people who are involved in the governance of these applications should take a broader view than merely a technological problem. This is a really small slice of a very broad piece of kind of critical computing studies, as well as feminist media studies and socio-technical critique. So right now we're having a big cultural moment, right? We are seeing the reaction to sort of like rightful demands for greater representation and inclusion, kind of playing out in mass media in a really novel way, and those reactions as well, first, the demands as well as the reactions are getting a lot of, and leading to an increasing amount of strife and conflict that we are culturally working through. But in smaller spheres, like this very specific part of the library world, we're starting to see considerable interest in initiatives to encourage more people from historically marginalized communities to either take up coding or take up technological work as well, on the assumption that having a more diverse cohort of people in the room, which is certainly true, can lead to better products. But there's also work that needs to be done by the people who are already maintaining systems rather than simply treating this as some sort of a pipeline problem. So at this juncture, why should library systems be radical anyways? The main one that I can think of is that the history of digital projects, and I have worked on many of them, are pretty inherently supportive of social justice goals, right? Both from the open access to research side of things as well as cultural heritage. So at the University of Maryland Libraries, we have contributed some amount of support, towards a project called the International Children's Digital Library. And the ICDL's mission is to make children's books from around the world globally available openly. With the idea that that can foster greater understanding across cultures and communities from an early age. Like, what an aspiration, right? Texas Digital Library, Chronicling America, quite a lot of other projects. They have these large aspirational goals about humanity. And I often go back to the Budapest Initiative, right? When it comes to open access. and how radical an idea that is, that it unites humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. Like, what a mission. We're already engaged in a lot of this work, and the tools and the infrastructure that we develop and we create are what we have to foster those goals. And I think that they should be in alignment. And finally, when it comes to open systems in particular, I think that it is uniquely appropriate for open source applications to be the mechanisms that we use to promote those huge social justice objectives, because they are in opposition to neoliberal influences. Especially when it comes to a lot of digital projects work, this is one of the few things that we make in our libraries. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to assert more agency and more values in those systems than we have traditionally been empowered to do. As for how we get there, there are a lot of scholars out there that are writing about and advocating the ethics of care, which is a moral framework for understanding ethics as an interpersonal and relational construct. Excuse me. The term and the theory originates with Carol Gilligan, but it's been explored at length by a number of scholars, including Nell Noddings, Virginia Held, and Joan Tronto, whose work I'm kind of referencing here in this slide. Joan Tronto has sort of like this 4 phases of care notion. So that first and foremost, care requires like an awareness of a need, right? So we might think of that as a need of our users. We might think of it as a need of our colleagues. We might think of it in terms of its, environmental needs. So care requires first and foremost becoming aware of the need. It then also requires and necessitates assuming responsibility for that need, that the care or that the maintainers of a system, that the users of that system and the managers of it are assuming responsibility for the needs of end users, students, researchers, environmental needs that may need to be considered, etc. The third piece of it is that the care work, the actual giving of care, must be intentional and competent, right? So it actually has to meet the need, which sometimes is a novel concept, rather than be ignorant of that need or not necessarily, or take actions that don't address that. And then finally, there's this piece about care receiving. And this is also a tricky part of it, which is that care must be responsive to feedback about the caregiving. So that if we are not delivering and meeting the needs of our users, that we take a responsive and intentional approach around that, or to anyone that we are serving and providing care to. This is an idea that is getting an increasing amount of traction. So recently, the Information Maintenance as a Practice of Care report has come out from the maintainers, which I've cited in this presentation. We'll get to all of my radical reading list, I guess, at the end of this. But ultimately, the radical system must embrace care. Care of all the users, care of staff, care of the environment, care of its role and continuity of human knowledge. And that has to start with intentional practice. And at this juncture, what I'm hoping works as for the interactive piece of this is that we have a reflection opportunity. And so what I would ask of participants, and if you're comfortable tweeting under the hashtag, I'd encourage you to do that. Otherwise, another good opportunity would be to use the chat tools under Zoom to sort of share, how you feel and think about the question that I have posed here, right? That how can we professionally and personally imbue our systems with care? What does it look like to create and maintain a system with radical practice? And so we have a few minutes of time, and I will take a look at chat responses on this. from Ava. We can imbue all we want, but we need support and agency to do so from the institution. That is a really good point. Yeah, and Lisa Schiff, by grounding all projects in an understanding of the problems, practices, and goals of the communities of people that we are trying to support. Yeah, advocating for system flexibility. Yeah, the institutional piece is one of the hardest ones, right? Because it's, I often think about this, like I said, at those 3 levels, and I have agency in my relationships with my colleagues, and, what we can do, but I have less of that when it comes to the organization. And yeah, that can be hard. Listen, listen, listen from Rebecca, to our users and to each other. So what do people actually need? Creating opportunities for conversations from Marjorie, conversations about systems and involvement in modifying them. From a metadata perspective, being sensitive to what types of facets would be helpful to draw out hidden items in digital platforms. And metadata advocacy. This is how I know I'm with my people, is when 3 people go, oh, metadata, and get excited about that. Yeah, flexibility in terms of next generation systems, frequent UX and usability testing with diverse audience needs. Yeah, this is, yeah, fantastic. Informed information architecture. Yeah. In particular, when it comes to the user experience testing, I have been thinking a lot about how our local user experience work, and we have quite a body of that, matriculates up into these projects, and what the mechanism looks like for that. And I also think a lot about how that work can be elevated more and rewarded in the way that, direct contributions of code and documentation can be rewarded in some of these organizations. Yeah. So from Ruth, accepting feedback, being open to someone saying that they don't want you, or that they don't want your care. Ooh. Whether because you're doing it badly, they don't have the energy for that relationship and want things to be quiet, or they've had bad experiences with preferred care in workplace and the outside. I think that's an extraordinary point, is, to be responsive to the rejection of care and proceed accordingly and be respectful of that. I can speak to, I know relationships, at my current campus and my previous campus that have been broken. And we have had to acknowledge that and let the people who have been trespassed against move forward, or, be respected. So we are coming up on kind of the close end of my time. This is phenomenal feedback. So, yeah, we might have more opportunity to come back to some of this commentary and discussion, because I do think that it's pretty important to have. I'm tearing up, and I'm also, yeah, yeah. Decided that I would eat like a bunch of chips immediately before this. But yeah, this is fantastic feedback. And finally, I'll just kind of share, this presentation will get shared afterwards. This is a handful of items that are, that have greatly influenced my thinking on this idea and this topic. And I would encourage, this is, like I said, I call this the Radicals reading list. I actually have sent it to a couple of my colleagues and just been like, here you go, please read this. So, so yeah, again, this will go out, and hopefully we have more opportunity to all engage at the end of the webinar. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. Do you need the transcript for this, for the chat at all, for your work?
Because I didn't really ask for consent from participants if I use this again, that's fine without saving it. This can be an ephemeral moment in time.
Okay.
But, if you would like to talk with me further about it and share your thoughts, I am 100%, open to talking with as many people as possible about this. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the floor over to Roletta, who will introduce our second speaker.
All right. Just want to give Kate another round of thanks. I'm really excited to look through that radical reading list. This is a perfect time if you have questions for Kate about her presentation to pop those into the chat. Michelle and I will be monitoring those, and we'll hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to get to some of those questions here at the end. I want to introduce our next speaker, Jason Clark. Jason is professor and head of special collections and archival informatics at Montana State University Libraries, where he builds digital library applications and sets digital content strategy. His current research interests include linked data, search engine optimization, web services and APIs, interface design, and application development. You can read more of his occasional thoughts or check out some of his code samples at www.jasonclark.info. And Jason is going to be speaking today about unpacking the algorithms that shape our UX, algorithmic awareness as a form of digital literacy. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason now.
I'm going to unmute myself. All right, people able to hear me? Perfect. So I'm going to just try to limit this to about 20 minutes or so that we can get back to some of the questions. I want to thank Kate for bringing up this idea of open development. It's something that underpins a lot of my thinking in this particular presentation is focused on a type of a grant research that we're doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the algorithm. Really what I want to draw out in the course of the next 20 minutes is the teaching moment that we have as librarians and technologists, and how in the call that Kate was making for open and transparent systems, what that might look like, and how you start to teach something that at times can be very invisible. So I'm going to talk about algorithms themselves a little bit, feature some of the current grant project, which ends in October this year. We'll do, if we have a little time, we'll do a small class exercise. If not, I have slides that we can kind of show. And then I want to unpack at the very end what you're seeing, because what I'm going to do in the course of this presentation is just kind of walk through when we engage and teach and instruct around algorithms. There are a couple things that we're seeing, like with this grant project, about what works well in these workshops and modules. So there'll be a meta moment towards the end. I want to frame everything with something that that really helps to, when people come to these ideas, the idea of an algorithm, which is kind of this ghost in the machine when you think about it, that there are impacts of these digital technologies that happen and build context and build social interactions, actual physical social interactions. So this is an example. During the Las Vegas shooting, Gary Daniel was actually misidentified as the shooter. He received death threats. People came to his door, and he was just an innocent individual that had been identified incorrectly. This is part of what Kate was sort of speaking to, is that there, within the neoliberal interpretation of, or even the libertarian interpretation of, we just built the stuff, we just followed the rules, the software does its thing. There's a very underwhelming response from some of the bigger technology firms to something like this, where an algorithm actually misplaced and helped to misidentify an individual. And it's sort of meh, that happened, right? But we don't even have to go to, I mean, that's a very dire example. You can also think through the ways that algorithms impact just our kind of our everyday. So I want to talk about lunch for a second. It's close to lunchtime on the East Coast. Great to see everyone. I know that there are a lot of us from the East Coast right now. I'm not, I'm Mountain Time. But if you think about lunch, hold on a sec. Lost something. Are you seeing anything? Why wouldn't it be? The slides will be there. I guess I'll just provide a little more context, and I want to move on quickly, not to derail us too much. But Ranjan Roy wrote an article about the sweet greenification of just the shopping experience. And one of the points in this article is more related to even the social interaction, what you think of a physical interaction, how you go out to lunch, the silos that we work through and are kind of moved through in the physical world are dictated sometimes by apps, by a certain level of taste that is projected through our systems, and then we move into that system. Like this is an article about Sweet Green and the sort of boutique-y market around lunch, and the loss of the deli moment, what he calls the deli moment, where all kinds of individuals from all classes actually showed up for lunch. So the point here being, as you move through these environments, it's very easy to find very impactful material consequences to an algorithm. And what's striking about that is that as Kate pointed out, there's kind of this idea that that's just what happens. So when we think about this, and this has been the focus of the current research I'm working through, trying to build out and increasingly show how algorithms move and are embedded in our software is something that I'm intensely interested in, and this grant in particular takes a look at. So the question for us is, what if we could start to think about new forms of literacy, and what if algorithms weren't that ghost in the machine? Inspiration from some of this is related to those of you familiar with Sophia Noble. There's also a long-standing within the Academy critical algorithm studies. This is not something that's new. Criticism of ICT types of information communication technologies goes back years, right? The Academy's been thinking about this for a long time. So a couple links there. And as we think about this is that that moment for us, right? And so I wanted to think through this research itself that we've been talking about. Thank the IMLS for their support. This is a small planning grant that I put together with a team. So I want to just also recognize two individuals, two women that are on the team. Undergraduate Julian Kaptanian, who's been foundational. She teaches occasionally when we do these workshops. Marielle Karinga has also worked with us, is currently working with us on some of the technical components around auditing algorithms. We had a really strong advisory council. You probably recognize some names on there. Again, these slides will be available, and I don't want to show too much, and I want to kind of move because I got distracted there at the beginning. So the initial work was really focused on what do librarians and technologists know about algorithms? How can we learn about them? From that, we kind of came up with a praxis of algorithms. So documenting these first principles of algorithms. One of the things we realized early on is you can't just go into and drop. I'm not a computer scientist by training. I'm not a mathematician. You can't drop formulas in front of people and say, this is an algorithm. This is how it works, right? So one of the things we did with the team is abstract the idea of what is a typical like if you're thinking through an algorithm, how would you define a first principle of it? And I'm a philosophy major actually in training. So this was really a comfortable space for me. And then we looked at other ways to write algorithms in pseudocode. So rather than looking at the technical implementation of an algorithm, one of the wins and one of the things that's worked when teaching this idea is to abstract it and move to a more general examples and exercises. We kind of quantified what the UX, the user experience of algorithms are, and we typically looked at ways, if you think about this when you're teaching it, you think of the models where people are typically engaged. So things like e-commerce and Amazon. What are the algorithms there? Netflix and viewing. What are the algorithms there? Facebook is another one. And in fact, it was one of the reasons that I pursued this particular form of research after the 2016 election, just recognizing the impact of my contextual bubble. So, one of the, you start to frame this idea, think through the things that work. So this is a more, we kind of simplified one of the algorithms that's part of the networking inside of Facebook itself. So there's an actual formula, Dijkstra's algorithm, but again, this is that abstracting and trying to just reintroduce this idea at a more, at a teachable level, right? So, and if you're talking about citizens, library patrons, library administrators, like this is the abstraction that works really well for them to kind of grok what's going on. We also, this is something really close to my heart. And when I was a little verklempt as Kate was talking, the idea of an open system. So we have a teaching tool that actually is part of this grant where you can run a search and then hit an X-ray button and see, click on a certain part of the search and it'll tell you what's going on. I don't think I have time to demonstrate that. I had it loaded in a different tab, but if we want to look at it later as time permits, we can do that. Here's what I want us to do though, also right now. So I want to try a quick exercise. Those of you who have a browser in front of you, I want to ask you to at least go, so open one where your typical browser where you're actually authenticated, your profile is identified, you're logged in. Do the same thing. I want you to run a search in Google. And I want you to run the same search in a kind of a cloaked browser, whether it's incognito mode, whatever you want to do, just something that's disentangled from your identity as best as you can. So this, what I'm asking you to do is just run a search on something like climate change. That's a pretty good one. And I'll show you what I see, but I'm also kind of interested to know, what do you see when you run that search? Do you want to take like a minute to run those searches? Can we do that?
I think we can take a minute, yeah.
Okay.
And folks, feel free to type in, obviously we're looking at images and stuff with our things with a web browser, but feel free to type in like URLs or whatever you're seeing in a textual way.
So I'll just give us a second. Same. Sometimes you'll see the same. That's interesting to see. And it's the same, so my ads aren't blocked. Yeah, you could switch into a different, somebody mentioned DuckDuckGo. So I'm going to show you what this is. The first example is in the Brave browser, which has privacy blocking. It's also, I disentangled it from my profile itself, so you can see that it's I'm not signed in. What's interesting is I get a lot more ads. Like the sponsored stuff comes forward. If you look at my, now we look at the next one. This is me within Google Chrome. So you see I get the kind of featured snippets. Actually, my first result is a NASA. I'm given, the knowledge card is a little different. So it's just interesting to see that when it doesn't know, it tries to kind of push ads a bit more. And there are lots of ways that you can think, but this is one of those demonstrations that provides people who are thinking through this is like, what happens when you limit the algorithm itself? Those moments in the class and in workshops or in teaching settings are really useful to just kind of ground the experience for people. So the way, I just want to mention where things have been going lately with the grant. And again, we've got about 2 months left, but we're starting to set up software to set up. So one of the things that I'm recognizing in this research is we do really well in framing the problem, and then we kind of leave it there. So there are 3 modules that are part of this work. There's like an introduction to algorithmic awareness. There's a second module around data profiling, and the third is what Julian and Marielle and I are talking about is constructive action around algorithms. One of the things that's happening there is what's a template for auditing algorithms? So we're starting to audit the YouTube search recommendations because that one's particularly problematic. I don't probably have to go into too much detail there, but the turn towards constructive action is something that's really, I think, important for us and important for the field to think through. We're also looking to pilot the module. You saw on our advisory board, there's a San Francisco Public Library, Kate Epler. There's a learning environment there where we might try to introduce some of this to just the general citizen. She has done some promotion on the idea and feels like there could be some interest at that level. So just thinking through, it's one thing for us to talk to each other and start to understand, but how do you move that into a teaching moment for a general population? And then the 2 modules that we're finishing, that we debuted at Open Repositories, we did a data profiles and algorithms. So we kind of looked at how the data that Google, Twitter, Facebook, you can download that data and then how that informs the algorithm and just that current awareness. And then that constructive action is the final module. So this is what I'm seeing as a gap in our field. It's our teaching moment. We're also trying to connect it more closely with the ACRL framework. It fits pretty well into the first bullet. And so we've started to think through how do we continue that momentum, and that might be another place to take some of the research. This is that meta turn I want to take for the moment, and we still have a little bit of time for questions. So what you saw wasn't module 1, but it was some principles that were part of module 1. So the things that work really well, we've given, I think we did a webinar for ACRL. We've done a DLF workshop, an open repository workshop, a local training opportunity here. But the things that work well are, you saw me earlier, although I gaffed with the sweet green because some reason it wouldn't load. I apologize for that. But if you go back to that first example, the idea of just taking the idea of something that seems invisible, like an algorithm, and applying it to a material consequence. Right. that's the moment where people start to go, oh, okay, this isn't just something that I do when I'm in an e-commerce setting, right? And that's what was really kind of compelling about the Ranjan Roy article, is that I started to see that even something as simple as going to Starbucks or moving into Sweetgreen at lunch, we're all part of a kind of federated, socialized attempt to constrain our networks and move us into certain spaces. Right? I can't read it right now. Hold on. Oh, right. And you saw the demo itself, although short, just gives a way to show the search experience is another, it lends itself to a really quick learning moment. That's why the teaching tool is more focused on the actual, the search experience and how you might pull forward what's going on behind the scenes. But the other takeaway, if you're starting to think about how to teach this stuff, find ways to show that algorithm in action, whether it's, oh, do you know how your friends are connected to you in Facebook? Or for the example we did, what happens if you try to obscure data from the algorithm? Sometimes it doesn't do much, sometimes it does. And then leaving space for everyone to discuss. Those are all the essentials. So this is our community, our opportunity. We are the librarians of tech. This is our teaching moment. I think that's something really rich for us to consider. And there's, along with building open systems as Kate and radical systems, finding our radical teaching moment, I think, is a really, it's something that's here for us right now, right? 200 people in this room today. As far as ways to contribute or just get in contact with me, lots of ways to do that. The project is here. And even as I'm flashing that up there, I recognize that for some, even the things that Kate was talking about, technological barriers like GitHub, version control, that's not, those kinds of things can be barriers to entry for lots of people. In this case, I need version control. And sometimes there's a GUI, but Kate's got me thinking about the software and the ways that I promote the project itself already. So please reach out, follow. This is me. And then let's continue our questions. We can go back to Kate's questions. We can pick up on some of my ideas, wherever the group wants to go. We have about at least 10 minutes left. So thank you. I'm going to stop share.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. That was fascinating. Before you, excuse me, before you stop share, there have been a number of folks who were interested in the X-ray tool that shows the algorithm of the search.
Sure.
Wouldn't mind demonstrating that really quickly. I think that would be really interesting to folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think it's, yeah, I can. Hold on a moment. I have it loaded. Don't judge me. I have lots of tabs open. It's my life. Yeah, share. Hold on. Not that. I need my browser. Escape. So I'm going to zero it out so you can see it. And we're going to refine this. It's all, somebody could take this and load it, create it locally. We don't have a package installer for it, but it's all client-side JavaScript. If people know what that means it's, if you have a web browser, you can run this, right? So as a teaching tool, it's fairly portable. So if we do something like library hours, this was there's this moment. If you look on, can everybody see? I guess before I go too far. Yes.
Yep, it looks great. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. What happens is you can click on this button, and then depending on what you see, it'll allow you to sort of pop over and provide an information bubble about what's happening. So this is that, it's a teaching moment, but it's also that transparency moment that Kate was speaking to in a system where you have a chance to create this as, the transparency is not what's the expression? It's not a bug. It's the feature, right? It's the moment where you're able to understand what's happening and you can turn it on and off. These various, this was a search prototype because I was working through anticipatory design, just trying to figure out how to customize for people without using too much information, right? Like without building that same kind of profiling we were seeing inside of Google search results, that's kind of wiped away here. There's no real strong identity tied into it. But each of them, like the offer, you can use current date and time. Everything is explained, is potentially explained as you move through. Should I stop share? I'm going to stop share. That's the Briar. That is the link to see it. We haven't questions. Michelle and Verletta, do you want to moderate a bit before we just, because if we start answering questions at the very end, I don't want to miss stuff that Kate might want to speak to, or that other questions from the people in the room.
We have a couple of questions that have come in. We're down to the last 8 minutes of our time. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if this platform turns into a pumpkin after that point or not. Mm-hmm. But I think, Verletta, you can speak to this, but maybe we take a couple of questions.
I think that would be great, yeah.
Go for it, ask away.
So we have a question for Kate from earlier. Question was, curious to hear what you think can be done to improve the pipeline entry between diverse new staff and folks already doing this work. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, or Jason may have some things to say too.
Boy, that gets into a lot of issues, many of them I think bigger than this conversation, right? So there are kind of a couple of ways to approach this, right? So there's this idea of like the IT and the technology pipeline, and then there's the libraries pipeline. And both of them, I think, run into the same fundamental problem within the institution, which is too much of a reliance on short-term and temporary positions and contractual labor. And I think that that's pretty problematic. When it comes to, the IT side of things, there's like, just going off here, like I have a 8-year-old niece who participates in a couple of different like coding groups basically. And boy, she's so smart. And she's one of our Minecraft overlords. But like she had gotten frustrated because her group is moving at like a pretty slow pace. And she told me like prior to Christmas, or rather she told my sister-in-law, who then told me that she was kind of tired of like the play coding and she wanted to do real coding. So I was a jerk and I just bought her the Ruby on Rails like O'Reilly book as her Christmas gift and called it a day. So there are a lot of initiatives out there. I think they're geared specifically towards women, towards people of color, towards LGBT communities, to try and encourage like more technology participation. And then, oftentimes they run into, at some point, like the same level of nastiness that we haven't fundamentally resolved, right? There's good evidence that people of color and women who contribute on open source projects are subject to far more critical review for equivalent code than men are. So there's that piece of that. There's, a lot of biases within the communities. There's a lot of cultural issues that kind of come out of Silicon Valley that I think have been really widely publicized, that all serve to make that a problem. And then within our academic library culture in particular, far smarter people than me have written at length. And if you haven't read April Hathcock, spammers. If you haven't read April Hathcock, either you know, white librarianship in blackface and in the library with the lead pipe, or you know, on her blog she's posted multiple times, you know, articles about these sort of temporary diversity fellowships and how they still fundamentally don't resolve a problem of, you know, diversifying our workforce, right? They just serve to have people of color who then also assume a disproportionate amount of responsibilities for representing the institution in search committees and in other very public-facing ways that are deeply problematic. So yeah, I don't know if there's a good answer to how to fix this problem aside from, you know, we can't keep having garbage positions, and you know, IT culture at large needs to change. And I know that there are people in this group that are not necessarily library IT, but have moved through, you know, IT communities, you know, who can partly speak to more of that, but I think also have some responsibility for, you know, assume responsibility for their cultures to the extent that they can. So that's my spiel. Yeah.
Great, thank you. In our 3 minutes left, we'll maybe end with one last question here. This one was sent for Jason. Are you looking into ways to teach about surveillance capitalism / attention economy as digital literacy as well? These could be closely linked to algorithmic bias.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that idea the data profiling middle module had there was definitely an aha moment with some of the, I saw people in the thread speaking to undergrads not knowing that there was an incognito moment or an incognito version of the browser. So like those are small advocacy wins. And with that data profiling, I feel like there's some room to really address the how capitalism impacts these systems and how by default they are part of a surveillance mechanism at times. So we haven't directly addressed that, but I think that's a really rich, and I love that you're bringing it up, a really rich opportunity to pull those particular themes back into the conversation. This whole algorithm study really just kind of keeps growing. You know, we've only been working on it for about a year, and you know, to see the attention and the ways that people and the way that it's shifting at times, like the idea of ethics in software development is starting to gain traction. We're seeing what happens when you don't really consider. When, you know, there was the Microsoft bot, the Tay bot, that was fed a number of just like raw data sources, and some of it, eventually it figured out how to do racism, right? Because it, garbage in, garbage out. So there are all these teaching moments that just sort of stand in. I think I'm starting to look more and more at voice interfaces as a particular version or potentially part of a surveillance capitalism. So I love that you're bringing it up. We haven't done a ton with it, but I think there's all kinds of potential there.
Thanks so much, Jason. I want to honor everybody's time. We are at time here. So I want to once again thank Kate and Jason for taking time out of your busy days to share your expertise with us. I think this has been a fascinating session today. Look forward to continuing those conversations. Also want to thank ACRL for hosting us today for this session, and thanks to everybody who was able to attend. There should be a recording of this session that will be shared with you all via email in the next couple of days. So with that, I will say thanks again to everyone and enjoy your afternoon or late morning, depending on where you are. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thanks all. This was fabulous.